Moving on with the configuration settings, we also have a feature where we can specify the configuration settings in a JSON file and use that file. So here you can see that we have this method add JSON file, and then we are specifying the file config.json. Remember that we need to provide the full path for the file, and here the path can be obtained using the environment variable environment.content root path. So this config.json I've created in the root directory over here, and you can see the same parameter or the variable name enable exception is defined here as well. Now in the project you can see that variable no more exists. So here when we will run this, it's gonna run exactly like earlier, but now the values are coming from the JSON file. Here I've set the breakpoint, and if I go and take a look at the configuration, you'll notice that this configuration over here in the watch window, providers count 2, and here data, and then we have the enable exception set to true. So this is coming from the JSON configuration provider. That's from this file config.json. Now let's execute this, and if I go ahead and go to this path exception, I'll be served with the developer exception page, because here the value was set to true. Now it's not that we can just have a simple JSON structure. It also allows to have a complex structure. For instance, I can go here and write something like this, settings, and inside this I can include this enable exception set to true, save this. So this file now contains settings, and inside that we have this enable exception attribute. Now in order to access this over here, a bit of change is required, and that is, instead of just writing enable exception, what we have to do is write settings : enable exception. Remember that we don't have to put a dot over here. Instead we have to access it using settings : enable exception. Now let's go ahead and execute this. Here again in the watch you can see that the provider count is coming up, and here the data is set to 1, settings enable exception to true, and let's execute this now. Now if I go here and say exception, you can see the same developer exception page is being shown, and this time the attribute enable exception was read from this settings that we have. Now there's one more cool thing about this, is that you can also include an optional configuration file. For instance, I can just go ahead and write here something like config.optional.json, but in order to make it optional we'll have to say true over here. And now you can see that we don't have this file currently, and even if I go ahead and execute this, this will work. So here we go, the configuration is still coming up, and this time you can see the provider count has increased, but here count 1, data 1, and this is the settings that we are getting, enable exception set to true. And if you have this optional file in the system, it will be included as well. If not, it will be just skipped. So let's run this now, and here if I go and say exception, that's what we are getting over here. Now let's go ahead and copy this from here and make this as enable exception only, and create another file. So let me stop this, and let's go ahead and have a copy of this config.json and make it config.optional.json. And inside this we'll have this enable exception settings defined. So now we are having two files, one with enable exception and the other one with just enable exception. Now here we are reading settings.enable exception in our startup.cs file. Let's go ahead and take a look at it now. Now here in our configuration you'll notice the second provider data is also coming, and it says settings enable exception set to true. The first one is now enable exception to true. So let's execute this, and here you can go ahead and say exception, and this time also you'll see the developer exception page, because now the settings is actually coming from the optional JSON file that we have. Let's go ahead and set it to false, save this, rerun it, and there you go. You can see the custom error page being served now.